Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today I returned from the Nevada Republican State Convention in Sparks, where I was a delegate. And I'm pleased to report that even though this was a very long and frustrating and contentious event, some great victories were won by the Ron Paul campaign and by the Liberty Movement. 22 out of the 28 delegates that Nevada will be sending to the National Convention in Tampa will be Ron Paul supporters. The 13 at-large delegate slots were all captured by individuals recommended by the Ron Paul campaign and placed on a Ron Paul delegate slate. 3 out of 4 Nevada's congressional districts were also taken by Ron Paul supporting delegates. One of the congressional districts, Congressional District 2, had the Romney campaign's recommended slate win by a small margin. There will also be 3 automatic delegates, the chairman of the Nevada Republican Party and the current National Committeeman and National Committeewoman representing Nevada. There will be a set of binding rules that affect how these delegates vote, irrespective of their personal support. And this was known well beforehand. Because Mitt Romney won the popular vote on February 4th, 20 out of the 28 delegates will be bound to vote for Mitt Romney on the first round of balloting. However, this obligation does not exist on subsequent rounds. So it is still a very good outcome that the delegates that were elected are Ron Paul supporters, because in the hoped-for event that Mitt Romney does not win outright on the first round, these individuals would be free to vote however they choose. So right now what is important for the Ron Paul campaign is to get as many people who are sympathetic to Ron Paul, and even better, supporters of Ron Paul, out there to the convention, so that if Mitt Romney doesn't have a majority right away, on the second ballot, Ron Paul could pose quite a challenge to him. That being said, there were some discussions on internet forums and even among some delegates about the possibility of changing the rules to unbind those delegates for the first round. Ultimately, that option was not pursued. The Ron Paul campaign didn't pursue it, and I concur with that decision myself. I don't think it would have been prudent to pursue it because at that point, the entire status of Nevada's delegation would have been challenged by the Republican National Committee. Already, threatening letters had been sent to that effect by the chief counsel of the Republican National Committee, Mr. John R. Philippi, which is how he calls himself, even though his name's origin is clearly French, so it should be Philippe, but I don't think he deserves to be called by that correct name, so I'll call him Philippi if that's what he wants to be called. But his letter is really quite appalling. He sent it on May 2nd, and what it stated was not just that the Republican National Committee would not accept any attempt to unbind those delegates, he went a step further, and he wanted the Romney campaign to actually certify those 20 delegates as Romney supporters, even though that is clearly contrary to the convention rules as they were adopted. The convention rules stated only that there would be a commitment of those delegates to vote in the first round in proportion to the outcome of the Nevada Republican presidential preference poll. Nothing about the content of their actual beliefs or their loyalty to a particular candidate or campaign. There was even an explicit statement in the rules that delegates shall not be required to announce their personal support for a particular candidate. I wrote an open letter to Mr. Philippi explaining this to him, and fortunately, this letter has received some circulation. I think what has happened now is, because the Ron Paul campaign has agreed not to try to unbind the delegates and to honor the rules as they were originally conceived, the delegation is probably not going to be challenged. So all these threats about the delegates having to be actual Romney supporters were probably just empty talk. And that's good. The RNC had sent an attorney representing Mr. Philippi, a Mr. Tim Morgan, to the floor to observe the proceedings on Sunday. And it looked like there might be a challenge from the RNC. However, shortly before the chairman of the Nevada Ron Paul campaign, Mr. Carl Bunce, went up to announce explicitly that there would be no attempt to unbind the delegates, Mr. Morgan left the room. He did not appear again, and he did not challenge anything that was going on, at least not openly. So it seems that behind the scenes, there has been a resolution that's at least workable in that sense. Now, I will say that the way the convention proceeded was quite frustrating and tedious and certainly physically uncomfortable at times. And it started at the very beginning. Of course, tensions ran high because of the memory of the 2008 convention, when the leadership of the Nevada Republican Party, particularly Sue Loudon, the chairwoman at the time, and Bob Beers, who was the chairperson of the convention, essentially shut down the convention because they were afraid that Ron Paul supporters were getting too many votes and that the delegation would be dominated by Ron Paul supporters. And as a result, tensions were high from the beginning in 2012. Because on the one hand, the new Republican Party leadership, all the old leadership had been replaced. The new leadership wanted to go above and beyond in making sure that the convention could conclude its business, that all the rules would be followed. They held an extensive 2.5-hour workshop on proper parliamentary procedure the day before the formal convention started. And there were some individuals who were Ron Paul supporters among the leadership of the convention, and among the individuals who weren't Ron Paul supporters, there were certainly individuals who were not biased against Ron Paul, who were intent on running a fair convention. That being said, there was a little bit of confusion, and there was a little bit of malfeasance, there was a little bit of acrimony going on, and I can say that what I just said was quite a bit of an understatement. When the proceedings began on Saturday, May 5th, right from the start, delegates were angered by a logistical mishap. There were two seating areas of about equal size at the convention. The front area was originally intended for delegates. The back area was originally intended for alternates. The problem was, when the convention started, there were about 1,400 delegates and about 89 or so alternates. So clearly, if you give half of the room to the delegates and half of the room to the alternates, there's going to be a problem, and that is there would not be enough seating for the delegates. Furthermore, the seating arrangements as initially conceived were extremely restrictive because delegates were required to sit by county, and for some counties there weren't enough seats. So, in true free market, spontaneous order spirit, a lot of delegates figured out that they could take chairs from the back area of the convention hall and move them up to the front. However, the leadership of the convention did not like that and started making threats against delegates who were doing that. This situation was resolved ultimately by allowing the delegates to sit in areas originally intended for the alternates, at least for the first morning, Saturday morning, before what I'm going to talk about soon occurred. But that particular incident certainly escalated the tension in the room, because with the memories from 2008, with the kind of hostility that had been going on between the Ron Paul and Mitt Romney supporters, there was, I think, a heightened level of alert. A lot of delegates were on the edge of their patience. So any mishap like that, even though I don't think it was intended maliciously, I think it was just very poor planning, but any mishap like that could lead to accusations of foul play and temper eruptions. Then, shortly after the convention began, certain individuals infiltrated the room with fake delegate credentials, dressed up as Ron Paul supporters, handing out slates on lime-colored sheets of paper, just as the original true Ron Paul delegate slates had been printed on, with names mostly of Mitt Romney supporters, with a few names of well-known Ron Paul supporters scattered throughout to make the slates appear genuine. Of course, it was a very poor attempt at that, because the name of Carl Bunce was misspelled. And furthermore, the two documents looked nothing like one another. The fake slate was only one-sided. The fake slate did not have a statement that it was actually paid for by Ron Paul's campaign committee. So they were easy to tell apart, and the Ron Paul supporters in the room caught on immediately. However, it again heightened the level of tension. What happened next was a 3-hour-long fight about who was or who was not qualified to be in the room, and whether or not there had been some mischief in letting people in to vote who were not legitimate delegates. And to keep the long story short, there was a lot of anger about this, because there was a suspicion by a lot of Ron Paul supporters that Romney supporters had essentially been bussed into the convention and allowed late entry, contrary to the rules. The leadership of the convention disagreed with this, believing that because the rules at that point were just preliminary and hadn't been adopted yet, they were not binding. But ultimately, this was much ado about very little, because it was all the result of a mathematical error. The chairperson of the Credentials Committee, when she made her initial credentials report, greatly undercounted the preliminary number of delegates. She said it was 1146, when in reality it was over 1400. But because they miscounted that initial number, when she then came back and made her final credentials report and said that there were over 1,600 delegates, all the alternates had been elevated to delegates, but that was only around 89 alternates, so the question arose, could it really have been that over 300 people had signed in between the initial credentials report and the final credentials report, even though there had not been even an hour of time between that? And even the chairwoman of the Credentials Committee denied that that many people could have signed in. So a lot of people were outraged because they thought that somebody was manufacturing fake delegates in order to skew the outcome of subsequent votes. In reality, I don't think there was any intended foul play by the leadership of the convention. There was just incompetence. a counting error. And I think this really speaks to something much, much deeper. And that is the fact that Americans need to learn math desperately. Desperately. I have a degree in mathematics. I'm an actuary by profession. And I just have to shake my head at the innumeracy of so many people in this country. Especially when it matters. And especially when it's a simple matter of counting. I wanted to get up there and to make a statement to that effect, that as a person with a mathematical background, it's just a question of the numbers not adding up. And I didn't know at the time why they didn't add up. I wanted to just raise a few possibilities according to logic and see which one of these possibilities could have been the case. Unfortunately, I ultimately didn't have an opportunity to speak because of the chaos that happened on the floor. There were so many motions and objections and, beyond that, various points of order, points of information, and even points of interest, which is not a legitimate action to take according to Robert's Rules of Order that were made, that I was absolutely confused as to essentially what was happening, what item was being discussed at that time. My inclination is to be civil and to only discuss matters that are legitimately in order according to the rules. So I didn't want to just get up to the microphone and say that without having it be in accordance with proper procedure. That's unfortunate, but what happened was 3 hours or so of wrangling over this issue, and then the chairman, Michael McDonald, made a very wise decision by calling for a lunch break and emphasizing that Ron Paul was due to speak after the lunch break, and we had better have that lunch break, or else there would not be time for Ron Paul to speak. Clearly, that was something that motivated the body to recess for lunch. When people came back, I think a lot of the tension had cooled. They were sated from the food, a little more level-headed. And behind the scenes, there had been some discussion between the Ron Paul campaign, the Mitt Romney campaign, the Credentials Committee. Behind closed doors, they reviewed all of the numbers, and they figured out that it had been a mathematical error. There were a few other revisions that led the delegate count to be revised downward by just a little bit. But I was appalled. I was appalled at how much time was spent at this and how much incivility there was about this. I understand that on the one side there was a suspicion of foul play, particularly after the fake ballots were circulated. On the other side, there was a fear that the convention would degenerate into chaos, so I think the leadership of the convention took a very confrontational and authoritarian stance against the people who were questioning the results. But ultimately, all of this was because of innumeracy and incompetence, not malice. And later on, during the convention, that would occur again. Ron Paul gave an excellent and thrilling speech. It has been recorded and circulated on YouTube. I encourage you to find it. I will link to it in the references section of this video. Much of the afternoon of Saturday was spent debating over the rules. In particular, certain Mitt Romney supporters challenged Rule 4B. Rule 4B stated that once a quorum of the convention was established, it may not be challenged again subsequently during the convention. The purpose of the rule was to prevent a repeat of the fiasco of 2008, where the convention was closed, allegedly for lack of a quorum, because some members of the Republican Party, including the leadership, are not satisfied with the way things were going. I actually had the opportunity to speak on that matter, and I pointed out that Rule 4b must be allowed to stand if we do not want a repeat of a scenario where a group of people walks out and thereby shuts down the convention. I also gave a little bit of history about the fact that the US Senate has had rules to prevent this kind of quorum busting since 1897, for about 115 years. And I think the delegates liked my historical reference to Abraham Lincoln once engaging in this despicable tactic of quorum busting by jumping out of a window in order to destroy a quorum at a session. I pointed out that that's not appropriate behavior. That is not the kind of behavior that we want to encourage at this convention. So Rule 4b was sustained, ultimately. And more generally, the rules were largely adopted as they were proposed on the day of the convention. That was good because the convention dragged out for a long time. Not all the delegates made it through until the end. However, had Rule 4b not been in place, we would not have had the kind of outcome that we had. Much of the evening, many hours, I think 5 to 6 hours, were consumed by voting in just 5 distinct elections. And that was the height of discoordination and incompetence. Because to take 5 to 6 hours just to have people stand up and cast paper ballots for 5 different elections is an entirely avoidable scenario. Ms. Jennifer Terhune, the chair of the Elections Committee at the convention, also a Ron Paul supporter, had originally proposed a solution that would have averted this, which is give everybody paper ballots for all of the elections in advance in their delegate envelopes. And then when it came time to cast the ballots, just let them approach the ballot boxes and put them in. It would have been much faster. Unfortunately, she had been overruled by higher management of the state Republican Party who thought they knew better. So as a result, people had to stand in line for hours to get their ballots. There were issues with getting the ballots printed, so much of the time that was spent waiting in line was spent in total standstill because they hadn't bothered printing the ballots in advance. And then there wasn't enough space for all the people to be standing in line, so it was nothing like an orderly, coordinated line. It was just a throng of people. There was some good that came out of this, some decent conversations. I tried to keep a civil tone throughout the convention. I even spoke with a lot of Romney supporters very cordially, because I wanted not to let the event devolve into ad hominem attacks. I wanted to talk about the issues. And one thing I really regret is that the proceedings of the convention didn't allow discussion of the issues to a greater extent. But I got to talk to many people one-on-one, including a lot of Romney supporters, and I'm pleased to say we had very positive discussions. I listened to them, they listened to me. I let them explain why they believed Mitt Romney was the best candidate, but from many of them I heard sympathetic comments about Ron Paul and sympathetic comments about the ideas for which Ron Paul stood. So I was pleased to hear that. I was pleased to hear that a lot of them were open to reason. A lot of them told me that if Ron Paul were to get the nomination, they would support him. And we discussed other issues that I think they had the right ideas on. One Romney supporter was extremely enthusiastic about autonomous vehicles or driverless cars. I asked some challenging questions, politely, because my preference is just to plant little seeds of doubt or curiosity in people instead of shouting them down or telling them that they're completely wrong. I would rather tell them to consider something else. Consider maybe a way in which their original position might be a little flawed, or just ask a question in a certain way that leads them to explore the issue a bit more and makes them a bit more open to forming a different understanding. I think that was successful, and I think ultimately, even though there was a lot of disagreement and a lot of suspicion at the convention, the fact that the business of the convention was able to be concluded, and the fact that there was no physical violence, the fact that most people were attempting to be honest and to follow the rules, the fraudsters were a very small minority, showed that this is a worthwhile enterprise to have undertaken. There were many times at the convention where I must confess I was very sympathetic to the anarcho-capitalist message. I'm not an anarcho-capitalist myself. I do think that a strictly limited government is necessary for the preservation of liberty and the protection of individual safety. But seeing the massive inefficiency at the convention and seeing all the tension, something I'm very much not used to and something I very much do not condone in my day-to-day interactions, made me think that the anarcho-capitalists are onto something, that they've identified dysfunctions in the process that are completely unacceptable and that we would be better off without. But, that being said, despite my sympathies, despite the massive problems that occurred, this convention was a demonstration that it is possible for the political process to work, and it is possible for it to work out well, at least in certain circumstances. I think this was also a demonstration of the merits of the view that the closer and more local the level of government is, the more efficiently it could function. Compared to the state convention, the convention of my county, the Douglas County Republican Convention in March, was extremely smooth. It concluded on time. It was very well run. It was respectful. Everyone got a chance to speak. The delegate elections were fair. And I think everyone came away from that convention content. The state convention was chaotic. And it was very badly messed up in certain circumstances. But despite all of that, there were a lot of good people there who persevered and who endeavored to follow the rules. And as a result, the business of the convention was concluded. And there was a very positive outcome in terms of the delegates who were elected. And the fact that for National Committeeman and National Committeewoman from Nevada, the incumbents, both Romney supporters, were unseated and replaced by James Smack and Diana Orrick, who are Ron Paul supporters. So, ultimately, despite a near catastrophe, I'm glad to say that the process worked. I regret that it was so tumultuous. I regret that it had to drag on for an extra day, because it certainly tried everyone's patience. I regret that the platform wasn't discussed as extensively as it could have been. The Ron Paul campaign actually wanted to replace the entire platform that was proposed with a very simple 10-plank platform which expressed fundamental principles. I believe it was called the Platform to Restore Freedom. And I was in support of that. I was in support of that because the fundamental philosophy of liberty was very clearly articulated in that. The platform that had been proposed had largely very good ideas, but some points that I would strongly disagree with, such as crackdowns on illegal immigration or opposition to any cuts in military spending. But that platform was so detailed that anybody at that convention would have some sort of issue with it. I thought it would have been a much better idea to have a statement of principles of liberty, a statement that very much resonates with Dr. Paul's message instead of that. However, that did not pass. I think a lot of people at the convention had actually worked on contributing suggestions to the original platform, so even if they were Ron Paul supporters, they didn't want their work to be replaced by an externally imposed document in their view. And I could understand where they were coming from as well. When that failed, however, there were a lot of people who wanted to make amendments to the platform. And unfortunately, because of the inefficiency in how some of the first amendments that were proposed were handled, there was not time to discuss some of the more important amendments. There was a lady that wanted to include a condemnation of the war on drugs in the platform, which I would have spoken in favor of had I had the chance. But because an hour was spent on another attempted amendment, even though that hour was not spent in substantive discussion at all, most of the members of the body of the convention were tired by that time. They wanted to go home, so they voted to cut off debate. And I regret that. I understand people's desires to catch planes or simply to leave a convention that had already been running for a long time. But ultimately, when there's an opportunity to discuss important issues, when there's an opportunity to change the direction of policy, that is an opportunity that should be embraced. Overall, it wasn't a perfect convention. The outcome was good. It was a realistic outcome that could have been hoped for. And I'm very glad that 2012 was not like 2008. I'm also very glad that I can say that if liberty is lost in this country, I did not sit idly by. I actually did something. I actually tried. I didn't say that the system is so corrupt and so fatally flawed that it's no use. I didn't say that my principles are so pure that I won't bother getting involved because no matter what resolution is reached, it wouldn't rise to the level that would be required by my principles. Even though it's true. Even though I do hold the principles of individual liberty and limited government in such high esteem that today's situation or modifications to today's situation would not satisfy those principles. But it's still so important to attempt to avert greater catastrophes and to attempt to preserve what freedom we have and to attempt to use what voice we have in order to move our society and our government incrementally in a better direction. And that's what I think I did. Even though I'm tired, even though I'm frustrated, I'm also satisfied. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this has been an informative perspective, and I definitely hope that Dr. Paul continues to experience similar successes in other states.